Hey, so today I just want to talk about an old X-Men movie for no other reason than it's on my mind. Is that okay? Am I allowed to do that? Okay, so the movie is Days of Future Past, which, at least as far as this franchise goes, has a pretty good reputation. I think it's remembered as the last time the mainline movies were good, discounting all of the spin-offs. But this movie is not the last time they were good. It's just the last time that they weren't schlocky messes. Except for this amazing line made by President Richard Nixon.
You're telling me these mutants are out in the world, and our best defense are these giant metal robots?
I wish every movie had a scene where Richard Nixon tried to understand the plot. So yes, the movie holds up better than its sequels. It's a pretty breezy watch. It's fun, especially in a few set pieces. Everyone turns in a good performance, especially James McAvoy. But given the premise of the old X-Men and the new coming together, it doesn't quite deliver on that promise. The result is an okay movie, not a great one. And as someone who has always had high hopes that the X-Men could get movies that are befitting of them, someone who was invested in both the original movies and the prequel cast, I wanted great. And I didn't get it, and I'm still salty 6 years later. But I think if you squint, you can see the greatness that is possible here. So that's what I want to try and uncover. And to do that, we've got to identify the problems. Now, presenting rewrite ideas for movies, especially X-Men movies, isn't really my thing. But luckily,
I know a guy.
Hey everyone, Nando from Nando v Movies here, and this is Rewriting X-Men Days of Future Past.
So this movie has a lot on its plate. It's trying to be a worthwhile sequel to the excellent X-Men First Class, while also being a send-off for the cast of the original trilogy, which didn't really get an adequate conclusion in their last film, X-Men The Last Stand. But I feel like the film fails to do either of those things that it's trying to do. Firstly, as a send-off to the old cast, it's pretty disappointing. They're hunkered down in this temple for the whole movie, and most of them have nothing to do but die. Professor X at least gets to communicate with his younger self, and Wolverine is... well, we'll get to Wolverine. Point is, I don't think just having these characters technically on screen is very satisfying, and in a better movie, they would get to be more involved with the actual story. There's an extended version of this movie called The Rogue Cut that tries to fix this problem by giving the characters some busy work, but I think those scenes were rightfully cut because it doesn't address the main issue. Nothing these characters do in the future can change the outcome of the story. Problem number 2 is that the story is not that satisfying as a continuation to the plot of X-Men First Class. That movie ends with Magneto declaring his war against humanity and Charles beginning his school for mutants. So going into the sequel, you'd expect that those factions would have, progressed a little bit. Instead, they've regressed. When we pick things back up with these characters, we find out that a whole movie's worth of events have transpired in the meantime. Most of the characters we spent so much time with in the last movie are dead. Xavier has both started and closed his school for mutants. Magneto has both started and failed in his revolution against humanity and is now alone in prison. And this movie ends with basically the same ending we had in the last movie. Magneto betrays Xavier again. Magneto announces a war against humanity again. Beast has nothing to do. Again. Really, the only thing that changes is that Mystique joined Magneto the last time, and this time she doesn't. But for the most part, the cast of new characters feel like they're going in circles in this movie. That's a bigger problem than I can hope to address in a revision, since it is the very premise of the story, but hopefully it can be de-emphasized. And we're gonna do that by changing the protagonist of the film, which is problem number 3, Xavier's character arc. Despite not appearing for the first half hour of the film, Xavier is the protagonist of the movie. His character arc is about overcoming guilt and choosing to believe again. I think it's a great idea for an Xavier story, but I never really buy into his moments of character development. It feels way too easy for Wolverine to convince Xavier to help him. His allegedly big moment of character development comes in the scene where he talks with his older self, but it feels like a detour. Just moments earlier, Xavier already made the choice not to take the drug that inhibits his mutant abilities so that he can help to save the world. So this scene with Patrick Stewart is just like a little bit of extra inspiration rather than the character-defining turn it is set up to be. So in short, What I want from a rewritten version of Days of Future Past is one that gives the old cast something to do, one that advances the story of the new cast, and one that has a clearer character arc at its center. Which is why I think Wolverine should be the main character.
Wait, really? Don't we have enough Wolverine movies? He's got his own trilogy, and he's basically the protagonist in the first 3 movies too.
Okay, yeah, that's true. We're not lacking for Wolverine stories, but I think in the context of this movie, where he's the only character who interacts with both the old cast and the new cast, I think the story would be better if he were more central.
You're aware that I made 2 whole videos about why Wolverine shouldn't even be the time traveler, right?
Yep, there are links in the description. But bear with me, because at least in this rewrite, I think if one character benefits from time traveling, it's Wolverine. So in the current movie, Wolverine's job is to deliver one piece of exposition to Charles before handing off the protagonist baton to him, and then doing nothing else. The movie tricks you into thinking that they didn't write Wolverine out of the story because they have him sit in the background of most of the shots, and he occasionally says one-liners.
Want to pick all that shit up?
But as far as the actual trajectory of the story goes, he might as well not be here after the first 20 minutes. I mean, just look at the climactic scene where he is flicked away by Magneto like a piece of dirt. So Wolverine is barely involved in the story here, but here's why I think he'd make a great protagonist at this point in the X-Men franchise. I think the rewritten version of the movie should start in exactly the same way. We see a post-apocalyptic future. The world is in ruins. Most mutants are kept in concentration camps while the remaining members of the Resistance are hunted down by the Sentinels. For our purposes, we'll call this the Trask Wins timeline. Trask, as a reminder, is the scientist played by Peter Dinklage who sees mutants as a threat and developed the Sentinels as a means of protecting the human race. We're going to make one change to the timeline, however, since the order of events in the movie is a little confusing and backwards. In the movie, we're told that in 1973, Mystique assassinated Trask. The military then captured Mystique and used both her DNA and Trask's plans to create the shape-shifting Sentinels that the characters in the future are fighting. Did you follow all that? Pretty convoluted, and thematically, it doesn't quite work, does it? This timeline is an embodiment of Trask's ideology. He's the anti-mutant guy in the movie. He builds the Sentinels. He creates this timeline, so to speak. So why then are we having him killed, but then also having him succeed? Like, why are the Sentinels getting made anyway? Here's what should happen instead.
When Wolverine goes back into the past, he tracks down Xavier and says, look, there's this guy named Trask who's building these Sentinels, and in a couple days he's going to capture Mystique. If he succeeds, he will be able to make shape-shifting Sentinels that will destroy the world and hunt down all mutants. In short, the main plot goal for the characters is not, we need to prevent Trask's assassination, it is, we need to prevent Mystique from being captured.
Also, as a side note, the first time the audience should learn this is when Wolverine goes back into the past to explain it. All of the characters in the future timeline would already know this information, so the exposition doesn't make sense there. And then you avoid the problem that the movie has of everything being explained twice. But that's nitpicking. Not unlike your podcast, mostly nitpicking.
Thank you.
Let's make another change here too. Since Xavier isn't the protagonist of this movie anymore, the story doesn't need to concoct reasons to involve him. When Wolverine goes to get his help, he's going to fail. Xavier is just going to say no.
Fuck off.
Or that. Beast will still come with Wolverine, so he at least gets one ally. But Xavier is too depressed and too disillusioned to do anything helpful. That way, when things go bad later, he'll have a reason to blame himself and change his ways. Okay, so at this point in the movie, the story takes what I consider to be a complete detour. Luckily, it's a detour into what most people probably consider the most enjoyable scenes of the movie. You get the introduction of Quicksilver, the infiltration of the Pentagon, and then the slow-mo escape sequence. It's all great fun, and it's all totally pointless. There's no reason in the story why they need Quicksilver or Magneto to do what they were trying to do. They just need to go and warn Trask about the assassination. They could come back and get Magneto later, if they wanted to. Instead, if the new plot goal is find Mystique, then I think this section of the movie feels more central, because we can concoct a reason for why the characters believe Magneto is the only one who knows where she is. He's the last person the audience saw her with in the previous movie, so even though this is 10 years later, that reasoning tracks. And yes, I'm aware that this is the reason Charles goes to free Magneto in the movie, but other than wanting to reunite with her because he has a brotherly attachment to her, he doesn't actually have a plot reason to be doing this now.
So the structure of the story hasn't really changed yet. We still have a movie that starts in the future, sends Wolverine back to the past, a scene trying to recruit Xavier, and then an infiltration to get Magneto into prison. When did things really go off the rails?
Right now. In the next segment, we're not going to have a scene at the UN. Instead, it'll be a scene with Mystique on the run from Trask and his men. Our characters will intervene, which will prevent Trask from capturing her. But this is where the timeline shifts. Not only is Mystique not captured, but Magneto just immediately executes Trask. In the UN scene, there's a moment where Wolverine encounters Stryker, which causes him to have flashbacks that incapacitate him for a few crucial moments. It sort of kicks his future consciousness out of his 1973 body. I want to go a little further with this idea, because what if, at the moment that history is changed with Trask's death, he is actually torn out of this timeline and thrust back into the future? Only when he comes to, things aren't quite the same. He doesn't wake up in the post-apocalyptic future that he left. He wakes up next to Jean Grey.
Instead of going back to the Trask Wins timeline, where humans are persecuting mutants, he is now in the Magneto Wins timeline, where mutants are persecuting humans. Because of the disruption in history that Trask's early death creates, the original future timeline no longer exists. All that stuff at the temple, gone. Which means that Ellen Page is no longer there to do the magic that sends Wolverine back in time. So when his consciousness returns to the future, things are very different. In Wolverine's new reality, Magneto has been running the world for the past 50 years. During this time, both Wolverine and Jean Grey were some of his top generals in conquering the planet, and many of the other X-Men characters were never X-Men at all.
The world is even more of a disaster than it was in the Trask Wins timeline, except now Wolverine actually gets everything that he always wanted. He gets to be with Jean. And with no immediate way to get back in time to fix things, he's gonna live in this timeline a bit. This gives us a lot more to do with the old cast, as many of them get to reprise evil versions of their characters. Like, imagine Halle Berry playing an evil, sadistic version of Storm. And most importantly, you can have scenes between Wolverine and Magneto where we see that Magneto is actually regretful in victory. He's won, but the cost weighs heavily on him. And now Wolverine has to make a real choice. Does he continue living with Jean, or does he try to get back to the past? Eventually, he chooses the latter, and the next part of the story will mean tracking down Ellen Page, who is definitely going to be some sort of resistance leader character, which means Wolverine is going to have to sneak around Magneto's authoritarian state looking for them, getting tracked, escaping, forging an alliance.
The rebels can even show him footage of Magneto's big speech at the White House that kicked off his reign, the same footage we see in the actual movie, which gives us our final plot goal: stop Magneto from taking over the White House with the Sentinels and giving that speech. To do that, he is actually going to need Charles, so Wolverine will have a second chance to bring Charles back into the fight. And it's here at the climax, rather than at the midpoint, that we have the big scene between the two Xaviers.
Not just them either. With the help of Cerebro, Charles will link his mind to Magneto's and both of their minds to the future, where Eric will see his repentant future self and decide not to pull the trigger on his plan. By doing this, we take the main attraction of the movie, the idea of seeing the old and new characters interact, and make it absolutely critical to the story. It is the entire climax of the movie, with old Xavier first helping young Xavier regain the will to fight, and old Magneto tempering young Magneto's anger. The result is that both of the disastrous timelines are averted, and we get the Xavier Wins timeline, where there is an equilibrium between humans and mutants. With this new structure, I think we have much more emotional investment in the main character of the story. We iron out a lot of the convoluted details of the plot. We get to spend equal time with both the old cast and the new in ways that are substantial and not just cameos, and we get to see all of the possible futures of the X-Men universe taken to their extreme in a way that is justified in the story. That's the movie that I wanted to see. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this kind of thought experiment, then check out Nando v Movies, where he makes rewrite videos for all sorts of movies, including a bunch of the X-Men movies. The X-Men films are a weird, wonderful, and sloppy franchise. But what makes the X-Men as a whole enduring are its distinct and memorable characters. If you want to write great characters too, then I highly recommend checking out Sabah Tahir's class on Skillshare, the sponsor of this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes on topics like freelancing, video production, and writing. In her class, Writing Authentic Fiction: How to Build a Believable Character, the best-selling author of the Ember in the Ashes franchise goes through the steps she uses to make her characters more specific and real. Take a look and see if you can incorporate those exercises into your writing. If you want to give that class a try, or one of the thousands of other classes on Skillshare, then click on the link in the description of this video. The first 1,000 people to do so will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Thanks for watching, everyone, and a big thank you to my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. Keep writing, everyone.